Hello, everyone. Hello. My name is Stu Pringle. I am your host for today's session. This is the seventh in the current series of transition pieces brought to you by Apollo. The whole point of this LinkedIn Live series is that we explore the big questions that are right at the heart of the energy transition. And the title for today's session is Megawatts Aren't Enough, Delivering a Place-Based Just Transition. Easy for some people to say. If you don't know Apollo, well, they are a leading engineering and advisory consultancy working across marine energies, sustainable infrastructure, and oil and gas, and they have over 180 engineers. Apollo delivers transformational projects, technical placements, and digital solutions that are shaping the future of energy. So, I would now like to introduce today's panel. Today, I'm joined by Craig White, who is Head of Sustainability and Just Transition at Apollo. I'm going to read what it says here. It says, Craig has 30 years authentic experience in sustainability before it became mislabeled as net zero. So I feel that's the opening shot fired in today's discussion. Craig has got an absolute mountain of experience in place-based outcomes and stakeholder partnership models from both in the UK and beyond. And I'm sure he's going to bring a lot of knowledge and thoughts in today's session. So welcome, Craig. I'm also joined by John Chaplin, who is Director of External Affairs and Special Projects at Bristol Port. John asked me to do the longest possible version of introduction that I possibly could. And basically say he's from Bristol Port and he's here to tell you what he thinks. So, John, thank you very, very much for coming along today. John is also the chair of SevernNet. He has extensive range of experiences in the port and he's dealt with various national and regional bodies over the years. So he's hiding his light under his bushel. So thank you, John, for coming along. I'm also joined by Martin Tulloch, who's Director of Energy Transition Net Zero Technology Centre. He's been there for many years now, and he's helped establish the centre's capabilities in offshore renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. Previous to that, he's got more than 2 decades experience and was Head of Energy and Coastal Zone at Western Isles Island Council. Last but not least, I'm joined by Ross Fairley, who's Head of Renewable Energy Team and Net Zero Services for Burgess Salmon. Ross has spent more than 25 years advising developers, generators, investors and funders on UK renewable energy and low carbon projects. His team have won various awards in the sector, and Ross was Deputy Chair of the UK Hydrogen Energy Association and Chair of the Renewable UK's Strategy Forum. So we have a pretty serious panel for today's discussion. In terms of format, the plan today is to run for about 50 minutes. It's split into 3 parts. We're going to let Craig take the mic and make us an initial statement from the Apollo point of view. We're then going to get into this proper bit, the panel discussion. We'll prepare some questions to fire at my colleagues on this panel today. And then towards the end, we're going to take some questions from you lovely people. So if you are in the audience watching this and you would like to ask the panel a question, comment as if you would it was a LinkedIn post, and that comment will appear on our screens. We'll be able to throw them up to the end and take some live questions from the audience. Please, audience, don't be shy. This is your chance to ask those big questions. Okay, we've done the introductions. We've laid out what the plan is for today. We're 5 minutes in. So without further ado, let's get on with today's session. Craig, I'd like to hand the mic over to you for your opening thoughts on today's topic.
Thanks, Stu. Welcome everyone to this. Should be a fascinating conversation and discussion. And I think just looking at the delegates and the audience panel members, it shows how diverse I think just transition aspects are in terms of the energy transition across the UK and beyond. It's moving beyond just engineering. It's actually about multidisciplinary delivery. And I'm no engineer, sitting surrounded by very talented engineering colleagues in Apollo, just I think reflects the shift underway. At Apollo, we really see the just transition as a generational and transformational opportunity to ensure that net zero is secure, fair, and importantly, addresses entrenched inequalities within the UK and further afield. We are adamant that the energy transition must deliver more, everywhere, and faster. And at this webinar today, we'll explore how infrastructure can deliver place-based outcomes for communities and, more importantly, future generations alongside the megawatts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Now, we are going to move on to our first questions. Because it's live and these things are fun, we've got a little bit of tech gremlins with Martin, but hopefully he can rejoin us in the next few seconds. So let's just see how we do, shall we? So question one I'd like to put to the panel. Let's do a bit of a scene setter. Let's start with some fundamentals. What do we mean by place-based in this context? And John, I think I might come to you first on this one as to kick us off, please.
All right. Thank you, Stu. For me, place-based is about solutions that are local. I think those solutions need to address specific needs, assets, and the challenges of the area. And clearly, those different places will have different needs based on their experience, opportunities. Talking to our specific area where I am at the moment in Bristol, one of the challenges clearly is that in relation to, for example, hydrogen, taking hydrogen, we have no heavy industry. You know, our industries in our region are principally tech industries, whereas, for example, in South Wales, in the northeast and the northwest, they already have a record of industrialization with the ability to produce hydrogen. So it remains incredibly challenging, but clearly place-based solutions should seek to avoid regional inequalities and ensure that decarbonisation continues to strengthen local economies and builds resilience within those local areas. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for setting the scene. Who else would like to jump on this? What do we mean by place-based? Ross, you look like you're ready to go.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything that John said there. I mean, I think I think John was getting to that as well with the opportunities, but I think particularly when you talk about the energy transition, it's about situating projects most of the time and where those projects are going to be. And it just so happens that sometimes they can't be situated somewhere and various others, but it's making sure that if those parts or those places that accommodate infrastructure which benefits the whole, and let's just take in a UK context, you know, the whole of the UK, that those places benefit from that. And you know, I was going to use the word compensated, but I prefer to use the word that they benefit from direct economic opportunities and benefits from actually homing that technology, having that locally, that's benefiting the UK as a whole. And I think it's all part of that sort of fair transition, fair to areas and fair to regions that are accommodating and moving forward with what we need for the transition.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ross. Okay, I think we've got a pretty good picture on what the definitions are. How about we move things along? So my second question, which gets right to the heart of this one. We all love a big megawatt number. It gets bandied around in the press and in discussions. But why are we fixated on the MW? And why isn't that serving us well? Ross, I know that when we spoke the other day, this was something that you had quite strong feelings about. So I might hand the mic back to you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is an interesting one because I kind of stuck. On the one hand, I think it is important that we focus on megawatts and large numbers of megawatts because we are in an energy transition. We're trying to replace fossil fuels. We're trying to decarbonize, and we need, as quickly as possible, to gain the megawatts that we need. And if we look at what we're doing in terms of electrification across sectors, we're just going to need more and more megawatts. So I understand why perhaps a government focus is on driving huge amounts of megawatts. There's a reason for that, but that doesn't necessarily help bring the place-based processes that we need. There's also a reality that we are in a global market, and therefore, if you look at the cost of development in the UK and a developer's sort of mantra in terms of building out the infrastructure we need, they are driven entirely by getting investment into their projects. They are driven by international competition to get the kit and the equipment they need. And that kit and equipment, surprise, surprise, will fly to the areas and the parts of the world where there's most opportunity to sell as much equipment as possible. And lastly, and this is something I do think we need to look at continually, government support, particularly in the UK, is driven towards competitions and driving down costs. And that is a symptom of building as many megawatts as possible to drive down the costs, to get support mechanisms for pricing, like the contract for difference, which is entirely based on size of megawatts and driving down costs and economies of scale. So it's completely skewed to people being overly ambitious about the size of their projects. In some cases, and I know we've probably all seen this. I know John's seen this on the panel. Sometimes you look at developments and they're almost artificially inflated in order to make sure that they qualify for government support. And it's not necessarily the best way of proceeding in an incremental way to prove and develop the technology. So why is it not serving us well? Well, I was kind of touching on that. I think if you really want true price-based benefits, and I'm speaking again possibly about the UK here, but I think you've got to look at new technologies where we can build the technologies, we can industrialize, we can take some of the benefits of them locally and in our areas. And to do that, you need to grasp the nettle for new technologies, as John said, hydrogen, green hydrogen, whatever it's going to be, tidal lagoon and so forth. Then we need to grasp these. And the way you do that is you build them up over a period of time. Having huge megawatts in one go is overly ambitious, I think.
Right. I feel like we've gone from introduction into full force discussion now. Ross, that was brilliant. Thank you. Also, Martin, welcome. You've managed to make it into the room. Hello, sir.
Yes, apologies, everyone. I am back, and hopefully you can hear me.
We can. Right, we've got quorum. Ross has just fired some big shots. Who wants to pick up on what he just said just now? Craig, I might throw this one back to you.
Yeah, sure. I was just so insightful from Ross there, from the kind of market perspective. I think, if we're just thinking about energy infrastructure in terms of megawatts, it just reduces success to one metric, which is important as for the various reasons, Ross has just outlined. But we're talking about other outcomes. We're talking about resilience. We're talking about community benefit. We're talking about, re-engineering, rewiring local economies over generations. And I guess we all see what we understand. I mean, I have no idea. Is a megawatt a big number? It sounds it. Does the Joe public on the street understand megawatts? Probably not. Do they understand jobs? Yes. Do they understand well-being? Do they understand price and cost? Yes. That's the things that matter. So I guess in some cases it's about, messaging fit for the audience. But I think we shouldn't try and boil or pare down, just transition or energy transition projects into just some very crude metrics, because it's much more complex than that, particularly from a place-based approach. And I would love to see, some appropriate metrics and or outcomes rather, in terms of some of the government funding. And if you look at things like HAR2, where it's basically, can you get a grid, can you produce, can you get in the market, is primarily the only driver for the delivery of infrastructure. We're not really baking in those outcomes at the highest level, even if investors are ultimately, depending on where the finance is coming from, also looking from sustainability outcomes as part of sustainable finance packages. So I think it's crude, it's appropriate, we get that, but clearly it's much more complex.
I'll just comment, if I may, Stu, further, and thank you for that. And perhaps as a civil engineer, I'd completely misunderstood the question. And electronics has always been a slightly dark art, and quite what happens to electrons moving about, and the difference between W and MVA has always been a challenge. So my interpretation of the question was that actually using megawatts is not the solution, because it's not what people understand. And a far more meaningful metric is perhaps megawatt hours per year, because that's actually how much energy it is. And as we'll all be aware from renewables, you know, whatever your wind turbine is, for example, if it's a 2 megawatt turbine, actually it's only producing energy for perhaps 30% of the time. Tidal is another renewable energy resource, but it's not on all the time. And whilst tidal stream and tidal stream less so, but tidal head might be predictable, then it's about megawatt hours per year, which is surely the metric. Another example, for example, is that there are proposals for hydrogen production facilities rated at 20 megawatts. But what does that actually mean to a member of the public, or even slightly technically ignorant civil engineers like me? Because, you know, you need energy to actually go into that facility to produce 20 megawatts of hydrogen. So where does that actually stand? So forgive me, that was my interpretation of this particular question.
No, completely valid. I liked it, John. Any other thoughts on this one before we move on? Martin?
Maybe just a quick point from me. I mean, I think I can see both sides here. I think it's natural to focus on megawatts and gigawatts and also, I mean, terawatt hours, because that's the number we need to go for. And we need targets, so that the Climate Change Committee's analysis shows that we need to double the amount of electricity that we produce and consume as a country. So from around 300 terawatt hours today to 600 in 2050. And that's going to need the installation of many gigawatts of renewable power. But it's a simple metric. It's almost become the default for progress. And you could have, for example, a 1 gigawatt wind farm coexisting with local unemployment, fuel poverty, weak supply chains. So that fixation on a number tells us nothing about who actually benefits, which is a really important part of this conversation.
Nail on head. Absolutely. Okay, good. Let's move along. Next question I'd like to pop to the panel is this one. Does the energy transition create tension between stakeholders? John, I think let's pop this one over to you first, and then we'll go from there. What do you make of this one?
Absolutely, it does. Yes, is the answer. But in two ways. In some ways, good, because the tension therefore creates competition between areas, and competition therefore produces efficiencies, the need to collaborate, and ensuring the best use of place-based solutions. So in that way, the tension is good. Clearly, amongst the multitude of stakeholders that will be involved in the projects, there are particular tensions and interests in relation to, for example, energy, impact upon the environment, number of jobs produced, trading opportunities, education, etc. But then I think in some ways the tensions that the stakeholders will have are unfortunately very bad on some occasions. You know, the tensions that the regulators and authorizing bodies face with limited resources. For example, the challenges of time, different priorities amongst those stakeholders, and ultimately the cost challenge that all of the stakeholders face for one reason or another, whether it's the stakeholder who's developing the site and the cost of development, etc., or whether it's even the cost of objection, etc. So yeah, so tension inevitably will happen as a result of place-based energy transition. Some ways good, some ways bad.
Okay, so a resounding yes with some important context there from John. Who would like to pick up that one?
Can I just add a point about the tensions? I mean, tensions generally result from a lack of trust, doesn't it? You know, that's principally what causes, or largely causes, tensions between the multiple stakeholders required for the transition we're talking about. And I guess it's a fundamental point really around the just transition, and making it very clear this isn't about, you know, having things done to you, right? It's about doing things with the communities, the industries, the sectors that are affected, and also the sectors that are going to exploit the significant opportunities. And I think we've perhaps lost some of that maturity around engagement and narrative. around actually, well, what is this actually going to look like, and how do we build trust at all levels within the system we all operate in to actually move things forward. And it's kind of like the previous question about megawatts. Shuts me off if I hear a megawatt. No idea. Don't care about the technology or the megawatts. I'm interested in the outcomes. So I guess it's as much about communication, but really it's about that level of engagement. And as a core principle of what a just transition looks like, communities, stakeholders need to be engaged at a much more mature and focused level.
Okay, thank you, Craig. I think both of you have used the word trust there. That is key. Any other thoughts on the topic? Ross, you look like you're go for it.
I think I would just add, I think there are some very, very entrenched positions. So the first thing I'd say is, when we talk about stakeholders, one of the stakeholders we should be considering is generational stakeholders as well, because there's a historic generation like mine where we're used to getting electricity easily, using it at whatever, in a very profligate way, just like some of the other, frankly, resources that we have out there and utilities out there. But if you talk to the younger generations, they're completely committed to the transition. And you can see this playing out year on year as more people come on board in terms of saying we need change. And we do have, whether we like it or not, we have that tension between current generations and the future generations, which I think are much more alive to climate change, much more aware of what's happening, and want to see a just transition. But we owe it to them, if we're building these things, to make sure that they've got jobs for the future from that transition. And I think the other thing that we are obsessed, particularly in the UK, and I come back to the point I was making about the megawatts, we're obsessed with competition and competing, which John mentioned that, and it's a very good point to drive down costs. But it's only a good point once you've got a base layer of technologies and you're able to drive down costs in order to deploy and take the benefit of new technologies and new systems. The government's really got to play a role in making sure that things that get built are supported to get to that level, so that they are able to compete later on and drive down prices. There's that peak to get across first, and I think we are obsessed, unfortunately, in this country with competing everything at the earliest possible opportunity. Even when we look at green hydrogen, we're competing everything. Why? Let's get some projects built up to a point and then compete.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ross. Any other thoughts around the tensions before we go on to the next one?
Maybe just one point, Stu, in terms of communities. And it's been a big focus of the tension here. And to my mind, communities often see the disruption before they see the benefits in terms of jobs and reduction in bills. And I feel quite strongly that community ownership has got a role here, and it's from experience. So 20 years ago, I was working in Outer Hebrides. I was leading the local authority's energy and coastal zone team, and that was when a few visionaries were actually setting up Point and Sandwich Power, which certainly when it was built was the biggest community-owned wind farm in the UK, 3 megawatt turbines, so 9 megawatts in total. Now, best practice for onshore wind is a community benefit payment of about £5,000 per megawatt. So for a 9 megawatt farm, that would be £45,000 a year. If you just need to look at Point and Sandwich Power's annual accounts to see the benefits are much, much larger than 45k a year. It's, I believe, almost $1 million. So I think that community ownership, and that's maybe quite an extreme example, but some sort of equity stake in projects could go a long way to certainly getting communities on side.
Good point. I think we all agree with that one. Any other final thoughts, team, before we throw the next challenge at you?
Yeah, I would probably be slightly wary about equity interest in projects, Martin.
Oh, go on, Ross. Let's have some. Let's have some debate. Go for it.
Honestly, we've been looking at innovative community projects and supporting them for years and years and years. And equity stakes can work. So don't get me wrong, and they can be useful and valuable if you've got a community that really wants to embrace that, really wants to pay attention to the project, really wants to be involved with the project, has got various individuals that are prepared to devote a lot of time to it as well, let's be honest. And when we find, I guess my point on community ownership in its widest sense is that I still don't believe we should be laying down edicts about it has to be a stake in the project, equity stake in the project. I think it needs to be horses for courses, depending on where it's situated, what type of project it is. But what we do need to absolutely make sure is that the community is benefiting in one way, shape, or form appropriately. And one community may well say, we're really up for this equity stake and this is how it's going to work. Others might turn around and say, we really have no interest in being overseeing this project, or being all we want to see is a payment and we will manage the payments. I think we just need flexibility.
I take that on board, absolutely. And some communities have the natural capacity to do that. They've got individuals with experience. And certainly in the point in the Sandwich, that was the case here. Colin McDonald, the ex-MP, was one of the key drivers. But I think if you give communities the strength, so part of this is looking at how can we actually empower communities? Can we look at Community Energy Scotland, for example, as a vehicle to actually give that technical and financial expertise into communities? Again, if you look at the Outer Hebrides, the local authority negotiated a 20% stake in Lewis Wind Power, which could be transformational for those islands. Compared to Viking and Shetland, you just need to look at the challenges there to see the sort of kickback from communities. So totally take your point, Ross. I think the next 5 years in particular are going to be especially interesting.
Okay, good discussion. Okay, panel, let's keep things moving. The next question that I would like to ask you is this one. Are existing consents and land use planning processes sufficient to deliver a just transition? If not, what else is needed to ensure place-based outcomes are delivered? Craig, I think I'll give this one to you first. Let's go.
Okay, I think not really. I don't think the planning system is largely about getting permission, really, and managing impacts, not necessarily about locking in long-term local outcomes. And I think if we're looking at some of the scale of some of the energy developments, these are huge generational, transformational investments in for some cases, very unique places, some of which Martin's alluded to at the moment. And just building up Martin's point, the Isle of Lewis is forecast to have £6 billion worth of energy infrastructure invested over the next 10 years. That's nearly the equivalent of the Olympic Games. So let's bear that in mind in terms of the quantum of investment, which for me means these are huge, complex challenges. And shared problems generally require shared solutions, right? Because it's beyond just the planning system to deliver those outcomes we're looking for. Multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholders. I'm a great believer in the development of place-based frameworks, which effectively, when you utilize the wishes and the opportunities of the individual stakeholders in one place, managed by all stakeholders to actually govern and deliver that process, connecting into the various service providers on the particular place. But it also needs to be owned by the stakeholders involved in the delivery. And I think the cumulative benefits, cumulative risks of that aren't really addressed that well by the planning system. It's still very much a piecemeal, project by project basis, in which case you lose the opportunity. 1 + 1 = 3, multiple benefits from scale and cumulative opportunities over time, particularly over sometimes 5, 10, 15 years transitional periods. So I think it's not robust enough really to enable this transition. And as we've touched on, it's about communication, it's about engagement, it's about investment, it's about a range of other issues that the planning system in some cases doesn't really go near. It's kind of too late in the process. So I think that cumulative and strategic approach for places that are lucky enough to have this quantum of investment, I think the planning system isn't necessarily the right vehicle. It's part of the solution, don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing it, but it certainly requires a much broader stakeholder approach around realising the opportunities.
Okay, now team, Craig has very, very eloquently touched on a number of important topics there. Ross, I could see you scribbling away while he was mid-answer. So I'm guessing you've got some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I've got three things to add, I think. The first is that government pick winners in technologies. That's what they bet the house on. So if you look at the moment with the energy transition, they're betting on offshore wind to be the savior for most things, and obviously a ramp up of solar and onshore wind. And so that inherently means that the transition and its embodiment is situated in certain parts of the country around certain coasts. And so them picking winners in the technology because that's the ones they're supporting, I think you can argue means that it's not a just transition, because there are some technologies that will benefit other areas that don't get the support. It's just a reality. And that probably leads me on to my second point, which is whenever you're dealing with government and then local government and planning, there is a political dimension to it. And we saw that in the very, very early days of the rollout of things like onshore wind and solar. Some local authorities, some planning authorities embraced it, took it. Others, every developer knew that even though there were very, very sensible sites in a particular area, there was no chance of getting a consent initially from the local planning authority, so they just walked away from that area. That's not just. And then last but not least, we are constrained in the energy transition by our grid system, our aging grid system, designed for a different purpose. And that dictates where a lot of technologies go. So again, planning, those technologies, funnily enough, and probably rightly, are where there's any grid capacity, but that means that all other things being equal, if you had grid in a certain area, you'd be saying there's better locations.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ross. Who'd like to pick up the baton from here? Any other thoughts on this topic?
I'll just pick it up, Stu, and I'd taken the question very literally as to whether the existing processes were sufficient. And in our experience, the existing processes are sufficient. So the planning system works, the DCO system works, the HRO system works. The challenge is not the process, but is things like the resources available to deal with the planning, whether it's the local authority or for us in the marine environment, the resources that the MMO have. They're currently predicting that harbour revision orders have a 5-year time wait. So the challenge is not the process. The challenge is the need for and resources. And then, as Ross alluded to, the challenges in rolling out these developments are, in our view, not the processes, but are other issues. The availability of electricity to actually undertake the development, the connections, the infrastructure, etc. So in our view, in answer to the question, it's not the process, it's other issues which are the challenge.
Thank you, John. Martin, do you have a similar view?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Stu, I think the others are much more expert in this area than I am, but I do think we maybe need to look at best practice and sharing that. I know certainly from what we've done in the Shetland, in archipelago, we've been quite impressed with their Shetland energy development principles. There's 4 pillars there. There's environmental one, there's local supply chain, there's a sectoral coexistence, especially with the fishing sector. There's benefits to Shetland community. So it's looking beyond the pure sort of legal planning constraints and looking how do you maximise local benefits. Planning and consenting's sort of a process that minimises legal impact and risk. So yeah, maybe it's something we'll get on to. It's how do we look at a slightly better system than we have today?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have got a look ahead question coming up, so thank you. Okay. In a moment, I'm going to ask the panel this next question. But before I do, to those of you who are watching and listening in, just a reminder, if you comment on LinkedIn, straight under the live video, that will appear as a question to our panel. And in about 10 minutes' time, we're going to pick up some questions from the audience. So if you're listening to this and enjoying it, or you've got something you want to ask, now is your chance. So please do, and then we can pick those up in around 10 minutes' time. Okay, but for now, back to our main discussion. Here is the next question. how much of the supply chain actually lands locally versus just passing through. And Martin, I might come back to you as the opener on this one, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that we're quite focused on here at Net Zero Technology Centre. The work we do in floating wind, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage is largely focused on maximising local supply chain opportunity. If you look at evidence, experience, you could argue that only a small share of the total project value has landed in the UK, certainly for offshore wind projects so far. Something that I sort of pulled together as a bit of preparation for this session, and I thought this topic would come up. So it's actually a really interesting historical document here. It's a memo from 1983, and it's written by Bernard Ingham, who was Margaret Thatcher's sort of #1 advisor. Basically briefing notes for when the Magnus platform was being inaugurated. So the briefing notes say it was the most northerly UK CS field, we know that, 120,000 barrels of oil a day. The key bit here was 86% UK offshore supply industry content. And you compare that to the other side of this, which was Highwind Scotland at 5%. Now that's an extreme example. I think there is, without a sort of more deliberate industrial strategy, we risk just becoming a transit site for certainly jackets and monopiles. So yeah, I think, in my opinion, there's a lot we can do in this space. It's actually a really big opportunity for the supply chain and for a lot of the companies who will be listening to this webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. Who else would like to pick up on this one? What's actually landing, what's passing through?
Just from our perspective, I think in terms of we're looking at, for example, Bristol wind terminal. I think in relation to the construction of that facility, it'll be construction workers fairly transient. But if we look at the example of the nuclear power station at Hinkley Point with EDF, the amount of investment that they've done locally is tremendous, and there's now an established supply chain of both materials, workers, and even issues like the catering, for example. So Somerset Larder was set up in order to serve EDF's nuclear power station at Hinkley Point, and that's rolled out within the southwest region. And they're even based downstairs. And the impact of developments like EDF and potentially the Agratas, which is the EV battery site next door, for regions like this are absolutely tremendous. And as I say, whilst the construction element might be fairly transient because those are people that are working around the country or potentially the world, then actually the supply chain opportunities, once established, will be fantastic for the area. Everything from STEM projects within schools through to colleges, through to physical nuts and bolts that are needed for all of these works.
Can I just come in on that? I think John's given a perfect example. I mean, I worked in nuclear decom for 12 years in West Cumbria and seeing how supply chains can be grown, developed. But I think the important point, and that John's raised there, is this doesn't happen just by chance. The actual we have to deliberately design in local content, supply chain development, supply chain support, like the work that Martin does up in Scotland. It's not just going to happen, and it's certainly coming back to my other point, not going to happen through the planning system. So I think the unbundling of packages, SME capability, procurement targets, sourcing of materials, all those kind of basic elements around what a sustainable procurement approach would look like to make sure those pounds stick locally. It's just a fundamental aspect of just transition, and I would argue it's a fundamental aspect of any infrastructure development in the UK. And certainly when we look at construction companies who have been doing this and doing it very well in the main for the last 10 or 15 years, it's just kind of an expectation. So I guess that when we're all looking at contracts or writing contracts or evaluating contracts, we should be expecting it to be there. And if it isn't, the onus is on all of us to make sure it is. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Very good point.
That's sometimes easier said than done, though, Craig. And it comes back to this point about whether you've already lost a large proportion of the supply chain for a technology, and it's been and gone, and then you're having to buy it back in.
Sure.
I would argue there's quite, there are bits of, we know, offshore and onshore wind, solar that we're buying back in, and I think that if you have a desire to drive down the cost of energy for the consumer and to compete technologies to the lowest possible build price, you can't blame developers for saying, well, I have to buy it where I'm going to get it from cheapest, and if they have stolen a march because they've already got the manufacturing facilities, I can't afford to pay the premium for establishing that in the UK when it's already available elsewhere. And I think that's why I come back to saying, when these new technologies are ready to go, and often in the UK, we have developed them at an early stage and then we lose them overseas. Those are the ones we should be focusing on, because we can keep some of that content in the UK, not all of it. We will never be able to compete on some things, but we can keep a larger proportion of that content if we invest in those early stage technologies.
Absolutely right, and just coming back on that point, I think it just proves how the opportunity's already been missed, doesn't it? But I think it's we're looking at energy infrastructure development. It's not just a particular technology. There's a huge amount of things that go into the making of that technology and the ancillary developments around it and the processes that make it function. And there's certainly nothing wrong with making sure that we're speccing local content and local SME engagement and development in that process. And I think Hinkley Point, Sellafield, etc., are just classic examples of how it can be done. Because there's still cost pressures on those, no doubt, but they did it deliberately. They designed it in, they baked it in from the beginning. So so I think it can be done. I think the onus is on what particular commodities around that infrastructure development should fit in that local community, in that local economy.
And the irony is, those communities, having benefited from it, are very vocal about supporting the technologies. Then,
absolutely, and it's just a circular argument, goes round and round. But I think it's just opportunity there. I think, but I think we do need to work a lot harder at it and say a little more focus around certainly what's going on in some of these contractors. And I'm always quite encouraged from what I see with a lot of developers in terms of saying the right things, in terms of we want to be delivering on the just transition, and that's great. Let's see that flow down in the contracts that you're pushing out. Let's make sure you are creating the value chains around your development, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
Brilliant panel. These are very good discussions. I am going to hustle us on a little bit because one, I'm watching the clock, and two, I can see the audience questions come flying in. So I want to have some time at the end for them. We've got one more question to put to you before we go across to the audience questions. And this is the look ahead. So panel, with everything that we've just talked about today, what would you say needs to change to make place-based outcomes real? Who would like to pick up on this? Ross, I think I might throw you the ball on this one to open up.
Okay, I'll be really quick. You've already heard me speak about supporting novel technologies, because I think there's some benefits there. So I would definitely find a way of supporting those better than they are at the moment. And the system that we have across the piece, like the contract for difference, doesn't really work for new and novel technologies. I think there's an awful lot of energy regulation which prevents really good place-based outcomes, like the sale of local electricity and various other things. And I think that needs to be reviewed and is being reviewed. So that's sort of regulatory review. And then I think, let's not be beholden to let's also maintain some flexibility. And it comes back to the point that Martin and I were talking about community. There are lots of different ways a community can benefit. Let's not do one size fits all. Let's give everyone models that they can use, but be flexible about how that might work.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ross. Who else would like to grab this one? What needs to change?
Just three quick points, if I can. With some notes before there. Effectively making sure that place outcomes are core scope, not just the megawatts, but fundamentally baked into the business model or backing and the delivery of a particular project. That needs to be contracted and coordinated, because this is not about a red line boundary, because that's kind of nonsense. That's just a project. It's about the outside of that and making sure that's built in to enable supply chain development and the multiple projects cumulative place level change we're looking for. And then final point, coming back to what John's raised there, is about learning from best practice. And Martin's given a brilliant example of Shetland, how they've already created the place-based approach, and how we learn as we say, energy specialists or just transition specialists, learn from other more mature sectors to bring that knowledge in, because some of these problems have actually already been tackled by other industries. So from another, like webinars like this, and being, I think, open enough to embrace new knowledge and new change, because none of us have all the answers. It's too complex.
Brilliant.
Too challenging.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig. Anyone else? And then we'll go across to pick up some of the questions from the audience.
We need long-term government commitment. We need commitment to resourcing the regulators and those that make planning decisions. We need a funding commitment, whether it's from government, National Wealth Fund, GB Energy, and we need certainty as to the way forward. I'll give a little example of that. In the development in the Celtic Sea, will rely upon seaports, ports like Bristol and Port Talbot, and others providing infrastructure. At the moment, the window of opportunity is limited to 3 1.5 gigawatt facilities. The capex needed to develop ports is incredible. To secure a return on investment, we need longer than those 3 projects. So there needs to be some kind of commitment, and whether it's through AR8, AR9 or whatever, but we need that certainty. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Martin.
Yeah, I think everybody else has covered pretty much all my points, Stu, so keen to move on to audience questions.
Let's do it. Okay, fine. Well, we've got a few. I'm just popping them up on screen now. We've had one from Alan, who asked about this. He's asking about the UN sustainability goals. We've had one from Rachel, who's asking about what success could look like in 5 years' time. And then we've got an essay coming in from Jonathan, who it's so big I can't even get it on the screen. But he is asked about existing planning and consenting regime, and is it fit for purpose? Craig, is there any of those that you think we could maybe tackle for the last couple of minutes of today's session? So we've got Jonathan talking about existing planning and consenting, Rachel's question on what success could look like, and we've got Alan's question about what does the panel think on UN development sustainability goals.
I'd like to reply to all of them if I can. I think they're all
yeah, let's do it. We've got a few minutes, so yeah, which one do you want to go first?
Well, the first one I think is probably one of the most important outcomes of a webinar like this, and it comes to my last point, and that's from Abhishek. Thank you for the informative webinar.
Sorry, Abhishek, because it wasn't a question. I didn't put it on screen, but there you go.
Right. Sharing, gaining information, sharing it, learning about the challenges that we're all effectively working together. So thank you, Abhishek. That was one of the key outcomes we were looking for this webinar. Fantastic. Okay, the technical questions. The point around, I think the from Alan, the UN SDGs, absolutely fundamental. I've used them many times myself, but the delivery of those is obviously very, very place-based. A very useful framework for us to be building off, but generally drilling those down into what it means, what that looks like from a delivery perspective in the particular place you're operating in, is generally how it works. But I generally use the SDGs to use that as the framework to then drill down, well, actually, what does that mean for that place? So yes, absolutely 100% supported, despite the fact we've only got 4 years, 3.5 years left to go for the SDGs, and God knows what we're going to end up with next, if anything. So thank you for that one. Rachel's point, what does it look like in 5 years? I'm absolutely baffled. I've got no idea what it looks like. 5 years, probably in engineering terms, is not much time at all. But I would think more everywhere, faster, coming back on my point, and I would hope more acceptance, more innovation around delivery models, and certainly more, I think, place-based, best exemplars of place-based projects being shared widely, and adaptable frameworks that can be used in other places, accepting the particular differences in localities. And then I think Jonathan's point, where was that one?
Yeah, here it is. I can get so much of it on screen. Apologies, Jonathan. You'll have to be more concise next time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think again that comes back to some of the earlier points about the creation of place-based frameworks around large-scale infrastructure developments. That's really, for me, how that would best delivered.
Any other thoughts from the panel on those? That was an absolute tour de force, Craig. That was, yeah. Take a moment, because that was epic. Anyone else like to add any of these?
I thought the 5 year time horizon is interesting because we'll have a new government by then, with various other challenges in the interim period. But in 5 years' time, it would be nice to think there was more evidence on the ground. Hydrogen Southwest, of which Bristol Port was a founding member, has a mantra, which is make it, use it, move it. And at the moment, we're not making it, we're not using it, and we're not moving it. And similarly, in relation to Celtic Sea, it'd be nice to think that we had moved forward in the consenting process that we have for Bristol Wind Terminal, and indeed that other ports within the area, including Port Talbot, have for their own proposals. But thank you.
Fabulous. Excellent. Any final thoughts, panel?
You may one final thought from me, and especially relating to the 5 year window. I think between now and 2030, 31, that's when we'll achieve clean power 2030. It's beyond that the real opportunity and challenge hits. That's when we really need to look at that move from maybe 350 to 600 gigawatts of electrification, and the hydrogen and the storage that's required, and the impact that can have, and opportunities it opens up for communities and industry as well. So yes, the next 5 years are important, but it's really 2030 and beyond where we'll see even bigger change.
If we're going to be fair to our generations and to our places in years to come, we need to get out of this current mantra of among some of the older generation dictating that it's just a fad and ESG is no longer important. And that if we really are going to condemn our places and to our kids in the future, then that's the way to go as far as I'm concerned. Gosh.
Martin, Ross, I feel like you've just given us the entire agenda for the next hour's session for those two last comments. So maybe that's what we could pick up on next time. Okay, we are just about out of time. Does anyone have any sort of closing remark that they're bursting to say before I start bringing this one to a bit of a wrap? Feel we've done this justice today, team. Good. Okay. Wow. In that case, we are right up against it on time. I would like to say to each of our panelists, thank you so much for getting involved, leaning in, and providing some excellent insights over the last 50 minutes. If in the audience, any of you would like to follow up with any of our speakers, they are all active on LinkedIn and they are easy to find. So please do pick up the conversation there. If you'd like to speak further with the team at Apollo, you can see the contact details on screen there. And that really just leaves me to say thank you very much to you, the audience, for coming along and giving up what's probably your lunch break for many of you, so much appreciated. I'd also like to say thank you to Apollo for backing this vehicle, because without them, we wouldn't be able to make this a reality and bring this kind of high quality discussion into the open forum that we've been able to do today. So that's really it for today. Panel, give yourselves a round of applause. You've been absolutely brilliant. Martin, thanks for bearing with us. A little bit of tech at the start, but we got there, so much appreciated. And what I'll do now is just say one final thanks to everyone in the audience for sending in the questions, and we'll bring today's session to an end. Thank you very much.